Hey there, let's continue on to some main points about Aristotelian logic. So Dewey writes, from this survey, which we've talked about in the last few videos, survey of Aristotelian logic, certain main points about the Aristotelian logic emerge. In the first place, so number one, in the first place, the forms recognized are not formalistic. It's a little bit of a paradoxical point. The forms are not formalistic in the modern sense of formal logic. So they are not independent of the subjects known, of what is being known. On the contrary, they are the forms of these subjects as far as the latter are actualized in knowledge. So the forms are bound up with the process of knowing. In the second place, knowledge, in its logical forms, consists exclusively of definition and classification. So there's a close binding here between language and reality. And to know something is to know how to define it and classify it. And Dewey goes on, neither of these processes is linguistic, psychological, or yet an aid in reflection. So they're not merely linguistic conveniences or psychological processes, nor yet just an aid in reflection, something to help us reflect on our situation. Definition, this is, again, the Aristotelian conception, definition is grasp of the essence which makes things to be what they are. Classification concerns the ontological exclusions and inclusions of real natural kinds or species. Definition and taxonomic classification are necessary forms of knowledge because they are expressions of necessary forms of being. So again, there's this interpenetration of knowledge and the thing known, where it's not just a convenient label that we're applying to something, but it's actually grasping the essence of the thing. All right, and then the third main point. In the third place, there is no room for any logic of discovery and invention. Discovery was thought of under the head of learning, and learning was merely coming into possession of that already known, as a pupil comes to know that already known by teacher and textbook. So discovery, nowadays we think of discovering something totally new, like a scientific discovery. This is not the Aristotelian conception according to Dewey. You're discovering what is not known to you, but what is already there, maybe to other people, to a broader mind than your own, as a pupil comes to know that already known by teacher and textbook. Learning belongs in the inferior region of change. So remember, change is a lesser mode of reality in this system. So learning belongs to the inferior region of change, and like every mode of change, comes to something, amounts to something, only as it falls within fixed limits of knowledge. So remember, the fixed, the unchanging, is what can be truly known, wholly known, and then within that there are changeable things, but those can only be known as they are occurring within fixed limits of knowledge. In the case of learning, the sole form of discovery, the limits are apprehension of the species present in objects of perception on one hand, and rational grasp of some essence defining a complete species or whole on the other hand. So that's a little bit complicated. But in the case of learning, so the limits of learning are apprehending the species, figuring out what the species is in that object, what sort of thing that object is, and the grasp of the essence of that kind of thing, of that species. Learning merely brings these two antecedently given forms of knowledge into connection with each other. These two forms of knowledge being the species of the object, and the essence of the species. The essence that is definitory, is that, if that's a word, of the species as a whole. And so bringing those into conjunction with each other is the process of learning, again, in this ancient Greek conception. Similarly, invention of the new had no place. It had only its literal etymological meaning of coming upon something already there. So I have not looked up the etymology of invention for a while, but Dewey is linking the etymological meaning of the word as coming upon something already there with this ancient Greek conception, whereas for us invention is a different thing, right? We usually think about invention as coming up with something pretty new, if not totally new, right? A new way of doing something, not coming upon something that already exists. So in a similar way to discovery, I'm not quite sure. We'd have to look into the details to see the differences between invention and discovery. But anyway, going on, these considerations explain the ease with which a logical theory which was strictly ontological or existential in its original reference became a merely formal logic when the advance of science destroyed the background of essences and species upon which the original logic was based, right? So progress in science continued, but logicians have tried to keep this same system in place, more or less, right? They have not changed the system of logic as quickly as science changed our ideas about reality. And so the existential reference of that logic kind of disappeared because we no longer thought in that way, but we kept the forms. And this, of course, Dewey sees as a big problem. The latter, what are we talking about here? I forgot already. The latter, so I guess this background of, I guess the original logic he's talking about. The original logic had no place for discursive or reflective operations, kind of what we think of as thinking, so particular use of language or development of language. So the original logic had no place for this, save as processes of personal development, such as might now be called psychological, but are rather pedagogical, by means of which individual persons arrived at direct apprehension of essences and of relations of inclusion and exclusion. So no place for kind of larger ideas or processes of reflection, except for kind of a more narrower idea about maybe psychological or pedagogical development of coming into a greater knowledge of essences and what they include and exclude. Hence, the perpetuation of the forms of the Aristotelian tradition, with elimination of the subject matter of which they were the forms, also ruled out by inquiry, which is effective reflection, from the proper scope of logic. So logic kept the Aristotelian form. Again, we have kind of a repetition of the point we saw before. Logicians kept the Aristotelian forms while eliminating the subject matter that the forms were part of. And of course, ruling out inquiry from the proper scope of logic, since we're not inquiring into actual existences here, right? At least in this formalistic conception of logic, which came out of the Aristotelian conception of logic. The syllogism in the original logic was in no way a form of inferring or reasoning. So it was not about kind of speculating about what might else be true based on what was true. So nowadays when people think about inferring, they're trying to thinking of it more maybe as like a scientific hypothesis. But that is not the original conception of the syllogism. The syllogism in the original logic was in no way a form of inferring or reasoning. It was immediate apprehension or vision of the relations of inclusion and exclusion that belong to real wholes in nature. And I won't repeat what I've said before about inference. I talked about that in the previous video. But yes, the syllogism was used, at least according to Dewey, for the purpose of immediate apprehension of things in nature and what are included and excluded by those essences. In its final and complete sense, all knowledge in the classic scheme is immediate rational apprehension, grasp, or vision. Immediate rational apprehension, grasp, or vision. And again, this is different than how Dewey is going to define knowledge throughout this book, and maybe how we modern peoples might think of knowledge, although I think some of us probably still think of knowledge as a kind of immediate apprehension or immediate vision of the essence of something. But that's definitely not going to be Dewey's understanding of knowledge. Reflection and inquiry were of the nature of the maneuvering that an individual may be forced to engage in so as to get a better view of something already there, like making a journey to a museum to inspect the objects found in it. I think that's an interesting image, interesting analogy. So thinking of reflection as, or inquiry as getting a better view of something, but something that is already there in its essence, right? You're not creating something or getting coming to a better understanding of the utility of something, but you're coming to a better view of something pre-existent, something there in its wholeness already, and you just need to get to maybe a better position to get a better grasp of it. Like going to a museum to inspect what is already there, but the objects in the museum are already there. You're not kind of mutually constituting them, as a Kantian might say. They're already there as the things in themselves. You just need to get to the appropriate place to see them. Right, going on from that point. Form, eidos, and species are views of wholes. Because of the weakness of mortal flesh, men have to engage in reflective inquiries, but the latter are of no inherent logical importance. And of course, for Dewey, inquiry is going to be of essential logical importance, but it's just a practical thing given for the ancient Greeks. It was just a practical thing that we needed to inquire because we're limited human beings. But that doesn't have any importance for the logical status of things. Knowledge, when arrived at, is grasp and possession of the nature of intuition in modern theory, only having none of the vagueness of intuition as that word is now used. And you can look at various modern philosophers to see how they use intuition. Intuition is definitely a very common word to be used in modern philosophy, and it's almost always very vague. There have been a few philosophers, like Dewey and some other pragmatists, who have tried to really kind of firm up the maybe appropriate use of intuition, figure out appropriate ways to use it and what it might mean in a philosophical, respectable sense. But yeah, intuition is a very problematic term in modern theory. But as it's used is very similar to what the ancient Greeks intended by knowledge, or at least Aristotle intended by the term knowledge. So from our present point of view, Aristotle's saying that things of sense are better known in relation to us, while rational objects are better known in themselves, is at least obscure. And I would say you find something a little similar in Kant, I believe. And I think Dewey doesn't mention Kant, but he gives a similar kind of explanation at the end of this paragraph. But I think this idea has persisted that things of sense, things that we kind of receive through our sense organs, eyes, ears, nose, and so on, are known in relation to the observer, right? While rational objects, maybe concepts, are better known in themselves, right? So they're not in the same way. They're not known in the same way, in quite the same way as are objects in the world that we perceive through our senses. So in a way, we can say that we know them in themselves. But this is a obscure saying, perhaps. If, however, the etymological connection between, and I'm not going to pronounce these words correctly, but if the etymological connection between gignoskai, gnoseri, and know with note is borne in mind, the obscurity vanishes. To know was to note the existence of something. And all that could be truly noted was that which already marked the subject of knowledge in nature. So what kind of defined was definitive of the thing to be known in nature. Sensible and changing things are themselves noted, not merely notable, in relation to us. Right? We note how they feel, how they look, and so on. Rational objects are noted and marked off in and of themselves. Right? So we don't note them through how they feel or smell, but through how they are rationally defined. Noted and marked off in and of themselves, so that knowledge is attainment to vision of existential defining. Did I read that right? So that knowledge is attainment to vision of existential defining marks or objective notations. So you have these two kinds of knowledge then. Knowledge of the sensible, knowledge of the rational, as, for example, knowledge of particular ideas, which in the Greek conception are not known to us in the same way as sensible objects in the world. All right, and I'm going to pause here before getting into the next related topic, which is the, as you can see at the bottom there, the fundamental difference between the Greek conception of nature and the modern conception following on the scientific revolution. So that will be our next topic. Okay, thank you, and see you in the next one.